Okay, so today we are talking about INTJ. If you have been around the MBTI community for any amount of time, you have probably heard this type referred to as the architect. And honestly, that name fits. Because when you spend time getting to know an INTJ, or when you are one yourself, you start to see that everything about how they think, how they plan, how they move through the world, has a kind of structural precision to it that most other types simply do not operate with. This is the second video in my MBTI series. In the first one, I talked about INFJ, which is my own type. Today we are going deep on INTJ. I am going to explain what this type actually is, how they think, what makes them tick, what frustrates them, how they show up in relationships, and yes, I will also share a little bit about what it is like to interact with an INTJ as an INFJ. Because those two types have a very interesting dynamic that I think is worth talking about honestly. Let me start from the beginning, because I know not everyone watching this already understands the MBTI system. MBTI stands for Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It is a personality framework based on the theories of Carl Jung, a psychologist who believed that human beings have distinct psychological preferences that shape how they perceive the world and make decisions. The framework identifies 16 personality types based on 4 pairs of preferences. INTJ breaks down like this. The I stands for introversion, the N stands for intuition, the T stands for thinking, and the J stands for judging. Each of those letters tells you something important about how an INTJ processes the world, and I'm going to go through each one in a way that actually makes sense rather than just giving you a definition. Let's start with the I, introversion. Like INFJs, INTJs are introverts. But I want to be clear about what that means because so many people get it wrong. Being an introvert does not mean you are shy or that you hate people. It means that social interaction costs you energy rather than giving you energy. Extroverts feel more alive in a crowd. Introverts need quiet time to recover after being around people. For INTJs specifically, solitude is not just a preference. It is necessary. It is where their best thinking happens. It is where they plan, strategize, and build the mental frameworks they use to understand and navigate everything around them. INTJs are often described as self-contained. They do not need a lot of external validation to feel confident in their decisions. In fact, most INTJs are deeply skeptical of opinions that are not backed by solid reasoning. They are not going to change their mind just because someone disagrees with them or because the disagreement is delivered loudly. If you want to shift in J's position on something, you need facts, evidence, and a logical argument that actually holds up. Emotional appeals alone rarely work. Now the N, which stands for intuition. This is where INTJs and INFJs share significant common ground, and it is also one of the reasons these two types often understand each other in ways that other types might not. Both are intuitive types, meaning they are oriented toward patterns, possibilities, and the bigger picture rather than purely concrete, immediate information. Where INTJs differ is in how they use that intuition. INTJs are what the MBTI system calls introverted intuition dominant types, which means their primary mental function is a kind of deep, internal vision-making. They are constantly scanning patterns, synthesizing information, and building long-term models of how things work and where they're headed. When an INTJ tells you something is going to happen, or that a plan has a flaw in it, they are usually drawing on a process that has been running quietly in the background for a long time. They just do not always show you all the work. This is why INTJs are often described as strategic. They think several steps ahead almost automatically. They are not just looking at what is in front of them. They're looking at what the current situation implies about the future, and they're already mentally building the path from here to there. Now the T, which stands for thinking. This is the biggest difference between INTJ and INFJ, and it is a meaningful one. Both types use intuition as their primary lens for understanding the world. But where INFJs make decisions primarily through feeling, meaning they weigh values, human impact, and relational considerations, INTJs make decisions primarily through thinking, meaning they prioritize logic, efficiency, and objective analysis. This does not mean INTJs do not have feelings. They absolutely do. But feelings, in the decision-making process of an INTJ, are considered alongside logic rather than above it. If the emotionally comfortable choice conflicts with the logically correct choice, an INTJ will generally go with the logically correct choice. This can make them seem cold or dismissive to people who are more feeling-oriented. But from the INTJ's perspective, making a poor decision because it felt better in the moment is actually the less compassionate choice in the long run. They would rather face a difficult truth now than delay the consequences. INTJs are also known for being direct. Brutally direct, sometimes. They do not naturally soften their words to protect someone's feelings if they believe those words contain important information. This is not cruelty. It is their way of respecting the other person enough to tell them the truth. But it can land very hard on people who are not prepared for it, and it is one of the reasons INTJs sometimes have a reputation for being harsh or arrogant, even when that is not their intention at all. Now the J, which stands for judging. In MBTI, judging does not mean the person is judgmental of others. It refers to how someone organizes their external world. Judging types prefer structure, planning, and closure. They like to have things decided. Ambiguity and open-endedness are uncomfortable for them in a way that perceiving types do not usually experience. For INTJs, this preference for structure combines with their strategic thinking in a very specific way. They are not just people who like a tidy desk or a written schedule. They are people who have usually already thought through multiple possible futures and have a preferred plan mapped out with contingencies built in. When external chaos disrupts that internal map, the response is not panic, but a kind of focused recalculation. An INTJ under pressure tends to get quieter and more internal, rapidly reassessing and rebuilding their model of the situation. Now let me talk about some of the things people most commonly want to know about INTJs. One of the first things people notice is that INTJs seem confident in a way that can border on intimidating. This confidence is real, and it comes from a specific source. INTJs do not express opinions they are not prepared to defend. Before they say something, especially about something they consider important, they have already thought it through from multiple angles. So when they state a position, they state it with certainty, because uncertainty would mean they were not ready to state it yet. They hold their views firmly, because those views were arrived at through serious internal process, not because they are stubborn or closed-minded. When new information genuinely changes the picture, most INTJs will update their thinking. But they need that information to be substantive and logical, not just emotionally charged. Related to this is the question of arrogance. A lot of people find INTJs arrogant. And I want to be honest about this because I think there is something real in the observation even if the label is not always fair. INTJs have very high standards. For themselves, for their work, and yes, sometimes for the people around them. They find incompetence frustrating. They find inefficiency annoying. They find small talk pointless in a way that is hard for them to hide entirely. When they are in a conversation that they consider beneath their intellectual level, it shows, even if they are trying to be polite. This is not contempt for other people as human beings. It is the reality of a mind that is constantly looking for depth and precision, and finding itself in situations that offer neither. The honest thing I can say about this, as someone who has interacted with INTJs, is that the arrogance reads as arrogance to people who need social warmth to feel respected. To people who primarily communicate through facts and logic, an INTJ does not feel arrogant at all. They feel refreshing. The difference in perception is real, and it says something about how much the compatibility between people depends on what kind of communication makes each person feel seen. Let me talk about INTJs and relationships, because this is where a lot of people have questions. INTJs are selective about who they let into their inner circle. Very selective. They do not bond through small talk or shared activities the way some types do. They bond through intellectual connection, through conversations that actually go somewhere, through the experience of finding someone who can keep up with how they think and who challenges them in ways they find genuinely stimulating. Finding that kind of connection is rare for most INTJs, and they would rather remain alone than fill their social life with people who do not meet that threshold. Once an INTJ does commit to a relationship, whether it is a friendship or a romantic partnership, they are deeply loyal. They do not make commitments casually. Everything they do involves planning and intentionality, and that includes who they choose to invest in. If an INTJ has decided you are worth their time and trust, you have passed a very particular internal evaluation that most people never even know is happening. In romantic relationships, INTJs can struggle with expressing emotional warmth in the ways their partners might expect. They show love through action, through solving problems, through making sure things work well, through being reliable and consistent. Verbal expressions of affection or grand emotional gestures do not come naturally to most INTJs. They tend to assume that if they have shown up consistently and done the right things, the other person should be able to see that they care. The gap between what the INJ thinks they are communicating and what their partner actually needs to feel loved can be a real source of friction in long-term relationships. Now, let me talk about what it is like to interact with an INTJ as an INFJ, because I think this particular dynamic is worth exploring honestly. In a lot of ways, INTJs and INFJs have natural common ground. Both are introverted. Both are intuitive, meaning they are more interested in patterns and meaning than in surface-level facts. Both prefer to have things organized and decided rather than constantly open-ended. Both tend to be private, serious, and oriented toward depth rather than breadth in their relationships and their thinking. Where the difference becomes significant is in the feeling versus thinking dimension. INFJs make their decisions through a lens of values and human impact. INTJs make their decisions through a lens of logic and efficiency. When these two types work together on something they both care about, it can be a very powerful combination. The INFJ brings the human element, the sense of what this means for people and whether it aligns with what is right. The INJ brings the structural precision, the logical architecture, the ability to spot flaws in a plan before they become problems. When the relationship is healthy and both types respect what the other brings, they complement each other in interesting ways. Where it gets harder is when the INTJ's directness collides with the INFJ's sensitivity. I am going to be honest here. As an INFJ, I do not need people to constantly soften their words for me. I actually prefer directness over vague, social politeness most of the time. But there is a difference between directness and delivery. When an INTJ delivers a criticism or a disagreement in a way that feels dismissive of the relational context, the INFJ's instinct is not to push back immediately. It is to absorb the hit, process it internally, and decide later whether this person is someone worth continuing to invest in. If that pattern repeats, the INFJ starts pulling back, quietly and without announcement, until the relationship has effectively ended from their side before the INTJ even realizes something was wrong. The INTJ, from their perspective, may have had no idea anything was wrong. They said what they thought was true. They were not trying to wound anyone. But the cumulative effect of consistently skipping the relational layer of an interaction is felt by the INFJ even when each individual instance seemed minor. I share this not to say that INTJs are difficult or that INFJs are too sensitive. I share it because I think understanding where these two types can genuinely misread each other is useful for anyone trying to navigate a relationship with either type. One more thing I want to address about INTJs, which is the question of vulnerability and emotional expression. INTJs carry a lot beneath the surface that they do not show easily. Their feelings are real and often intense. But expressing those feelings, particularly in social situations, feels to most INTJs like handing someone a weapon. They have learned, often through experience, that showing vulnerability invites responses they cannot predict and cannot control. Since INTJs are fundamentally oriented toward control over their environment and their outcomes, emotional exposure feels like a structural risk. So they manage it. They contain it. They express it in ways that are more subtle and less legible to people who are looking for conventional emotional signals. This means that the few people who do get to see an INTJ's genuine emotional interior are usually people who have earned that access slowly and consistently over time. It is not something that happens in the first few conversations or the first few months. It happens after an INTJ has accumulated enough evidence that a person is trustworthy, stable, and genuinely capable of handling depth without misusing it. If you are patient enough to build that kind of relationship with an INTJ, what you find on the other side of that process is usually a person who is fiercely loyal, genuinely insightful, and capable of a kind of steady, reliable care that does not need constant external validation to maintain itself. That is not a small thing to find in another person. INTJs are not for everyone. Their directness, their high standards, their independence, and their emotional reserve can all feel like walls to people who are more relational or emotionally expressive by nature. But for people who value honesty, depth, intellectual substance, and the kind of loyalty that is shown through action rather than words, an INTJ at their best is a genuinely remarkable person to have in your corner. Understanding them is mostly a matter of accepting that the way they show up is not the same as the way most people show up, and that the difference is not a deficiency. It is just a different operating system, one that happens to be very good at building things that last. Thanks for watching. If this conversation resonated with you, please consider hitting the subscribe button. I am currently working toward my goal of 1,000 subscribers, so I can finally monetize this channel and turn this passion into a sustainable part of my future. This is my unfiltered diary of solo living in the Philippines, from the long days in the ESL classroom to my journey as a beginner learning Japanese and Korean. Your support helps me build my retirement fund and keeps this channel growing. If you would like to help out even more, you can check out the Buy a Treat for My Pets link in the description. My dogs definitely appreciate the love. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next update. Thank you for being such an important part of this journey. I will see you in the next one.